Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Patricia Kranz. I'm the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. Um, we are delighted tonight to sponsor another segment of our series of conversations with award winners. Because unfortunately this year we were not able to honor them in person at our in-person awards dinner. So tonight we are uh, pleased to have the winners of the Morton Frank Award. Um, they are Rick Young, Emma Schwartz, Laura Sullivan, and Fritz Kramer of Frontline. And the moderator, who was one of the judges, is Jane Sasseen. She's executive director of the McGraw Center for Business Journalism and a longtime editor, reporter from Business Week. So Jane, I turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Patty, and welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. And yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation because it really was a really great piece. So let me just briefly introduce everybody and then we'll get right into it. So first we have Rick Young, who is a longtime investigative producer with Frontline, the PBS documentary series since the early 1990s. And then in 2009, he launched a partnership with investigative reporting workshop at American University. And they've since produced, I guess, about a dozen films for Frontline through that partnership, including Trump's trade war, which we'll talk about tonight. Emma Schwartz is also a producer and an investigative reporter with Frontline. And since 2012, she's worked out of the AU offices of the investigative reporting workshop. She's worked on many of Frontline's films as well, including the a film, Big Sky, Big Money, which won an Emmy, and another which won a Loeb Award, Blackout in Puerto Rico. And then I want to say next to her, but it depends on where they are in your computer, but Fritz Kramer, who is also a producer and an editor with the same partnership. He joined, I think, starting from the beginning in 2009 and has since worked, I think, on most of the co-productions between IRW and Frontline. He also worked on Big Sky, Big Money, as well as two other documentaries, that were recognized by investigative reporters and editors as among the best: Business of Disaster and Poverty and Politics and Profit. And then last, Laura Sullivan, who is a correspondent with NPR, where she joined the national desk in 2004. She's one of their most decorated journalists. She's a winner of 3 Peabody Awards and 2 of the Alfred DuPont Columbia University Silver Batons, which recognize excellence in broadcast and digital journalism. So it's a great crew. So what I wanted to start off with a little bit was just to talk about one of the reasons we chose your piece. It was a great category. There was a lot of work, but we were really impressed with how in this story, which is about tariffs and the trade war between the United States started by with the president and China, you took what is a fairly well-covered topic, started from what seemed to be at the beginning, quite a typical way of looking at that. You talked with steel workers, talked about, the lost jobs in the steel industry, went to the other side, the companies that have to purchase steel and how the tariffs were causing problems. But then you broadened it out and we went with you through this, I guess, roughly hour-long journey into a much more complex understanding of the issue as you showed viewers, and went, from to China to elsewhere in the United States, and sort of developed this much more comprehensive look at the issue, which was what we were really impressed by. So I wanted to just start with talking a little bit about, kind of what made you decide to take on this subject, that it was worth doing this, given that it is a subject that at the time was getting a ton of coverage in the daily press and regular news. So talk a little bit about kind of where the idea came from, and then talk a little bit how you developed it. Rick,
thank you. And if I can, just real quick, want to give a shout out to a few other folks that aren't with us. These are obviously collaborative efforts and involve a lot of people. In particular, co-editor Adam Lingo, our director of photography Tim Grucha, our IRW Frontline Fellow Emily Crawford, the workshop itself, which has been supporting our work and co-producing the work, and obviously Frontline and the executives there, Rainey Aronson and Andrew Metz, and NPR, who is aptly represented by Laura. So I don't need to say more about that, but we have been collaborating, which has been, you know, it really worked well in terms of being able to use multiple platforms and also bring more reporting resources to the stories. And finally, also thanks to OPC and yourself for recognizing the work. You know, in a nutshell, we had been looking, this was back in the, I guess what would have been the summer of 2018 at the time. And we were looking at a couple of subjects and trying to figure out what we wanted to do next. And in some ways, you know, and this was a subject that was sort of out there, but in some ways it got inspired by just a simple question that came from our bosses. And we always listen to those questions pretty intently. And it was, what's up with these tariffs? You know, what does this mean? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? And, you know, we didn't know. You know, we kind of like, well, you know, a lot of coverage on this, but hard to figure out is this, you know, what this all means and whether it's a smart thing to be doing or not be doing. And so it sort of was the animating question really as we began. And that what, you know, you were, you know, referred to this sort of journey that we took. And frankly, that was the journey of our reporting, you know, trying to understand what was going on with the tariffs, and then realizing that there was a lot more behind those tariffs and a lot more behind the relationship between the US and China and the significance of that relationship, and frankly, how that relationship was being upended. Not just through the tariffs, but really through the Trump administration's actions.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, and as you mentioned, yeah, sort of the structure of the piece, it was very interesting because as you went to each new place, the place mirrored, you know, the deepening, you know, kind of, it was almost like a layer cake, you know, the sort of each layer got deeper and deeper into it. And Laura, I wanted to ask you about that, you know, the sort of, as you went to each place and sort of your reporting was opening up, you know, these new issues, started with the steel industry, and then I think then went to China, you know, and talked with the auto manufacturers there, and you were at a trade show, and then came back to the US and ended up in Silicon Valley at a very different question, which is all about kind of future technology, you know, and the role it plays in trade relations and overall economic power. So can you talk a little bit about, as you did that reporting, you know, you very much as a viewer feel like you're going through a journey with you. Did it feel that way as you were reporting it? How did that kind of play out?
Absolutely. I mean, it felt like we were starting a story about soybeans on somebody's farm. And that just took us from one thing to the next. Before we knew it, we were in Silicon Valley asking about, you know, the theft of secrets and whether or not the United States was going to remain a superpower. You know, it's just, you don't really ever know where these things are going to take you. And I think one of the most interesting parts about this is seeing how the decisions that are made at such a high level, you know, I mean, not only at the top of the administration in the United States, but at the top of China, affect the daily lives of people at a steel mill in Middletown, Ohio, or growing soybeans out on the farms. And then even, you know, we went out to a conference in Silicon Valley where we saw, you know, people making gazillions of dollars on technology and investing in technology, but on the one hand, very excited about China being there, but I'm a little bit nervous. Like, why is China here? Are they our friends? Are they our collaborators? Are they our money bag? Or are they a threat? And watching all of these people try to sort that out. I mean, even the folks that we were meeting just on the ground in Ohio were saying, you know, benefit from cheap prices. And then at the same time, this was affecting their ability to get up in the morning and go to work. And we saw these towns decimated by the trade war or the United States' inability to launch an effective trade war for decades over steel. And then we saw, you know, so much incredible money in Silicon Valley coming down. It was really interesting to see how people's lives were affected by the decisions that are made like this. And it was really great. I think one of my favorite parts about this film was seeing the people from the Trump administration fight over it in the film, you know, and having different, you know, ways at coming at it.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, my little note to myself here, US access. Because exactly, you know, I wanted to actually also just have a sense also, you had obviously two very high level former administration officials, Steve Bannon and Gary Cohn, who represented the two sides of that debate within the administration. One, can you talk a little bit about, you know, getting access to them, getting them to talk and be so, well, particularly Bannon, so free with his thoughts as he often is. You know, maybe Emma, do you want to talk a little bit about that? You know, how hard was it to get access to them?
So it was not easy. You know, our first choice would have actually been to have people inside the administration. And we spent many months and, you know, many meetings and a lot of effort to try to get the administration on board. But, you know, because it was a bit of a roller coaster, you know, folks inside the administration only wanted to do press when they could sort of control it and be live on it. And, you know, so we had to sort of go with the alternative, which is people who had been inside the administration. And, you know, that, you know, it was you know, both Steve Bannon, Gary Cohn, actually Susan Thornton, who was a longtime State Department official who had, you know, left early into the administration over conflict with the approach that the Trump administration was taking on China. So it really took, I would say, months and months of, you know, persistent calls, sometimes meeting with their representatives. And, you know, in the case of Steve Bannon, it was a bit of sort of a ping pong where he was going to be available one day in New York and another day in Washington. And, you know, there was an agreement in principle and you weren't sure if they were just going to sort of throw you around until, you know, you got past your air date, but eventually it did happen. And, you know, we were really grateful to be able to get folks that could help articulate that conflict inside the administration.
Yeah, you really got a strong sense of that. And then also, you got access to some pretty prominent Chinese officials too. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, you know, same question, you know, was it, what did you have to do in order to get access to them and how willing were they to talk about these issues?
You know, China was obviously, you could maybe say it was a little bit more difficult in some ways and a little bit easier in other ways. We sort of lucked out on the timing of when we were trying to reach out to the Chinese officials, because this was right before Trump had threatened to raise the level of tariffs. And the officials were scared. They were worried about what that was going to do to the Chinese economy. And we're in the process of sort of courting the Western press in a way that they normally don't. You know, they were meeting with, you know, folks in DC, but at the same time, you know, that wasn't quite enough. We had to sort of reach out to folks who were connected with the Chinese government to kind of make the case that, you know, their side of the story needed to be told as well, that it wasn't out there in the press in the way that the Trump administration was framing. And then, you know, we kind of also stumbled upon this expo, which was about, you know, China talking about its sort of import and export market. And, you know, it both represented what was at stake in the trade war, but was something that Chinese government, which is not usually, you know, that press friendly, was, you know, willing to bring foreign journalists from all over into it. And that was a way that we were able to, you know, try to get visas so that we were able to get access, because it's not like we're inconspicuous walking around China with a bunch of, you know, foreigners and a lot of camera equipment.
Yeah. Well, actually, talk a little bit about, so, you know, obviously now certainly a lot of American journalists and other foreign journalists are having a lot of problems getting their visas or getting their visas renewed. How did you get a visa? Was it, you know, what were the challenges in that, or was it straightforward at that point?
Nothing straightforward about getting visas.
That's the word, but yeah.
I think you know, it's again, what Emma was talking about. It was a long courtship. I think the Chinese you know, embassy here was very helpful. Frankly, we had some help over in China as well, in basically just convincing them that we wanted to go and tell the story and present their side of the story, because it wasn't something that we were seeing a lot here. but it's a long process. I mean, it takes a long time to get it. And I think, I don't know, you guys correct me, I think we got actually picked up the visas just,
The day before?
day before we
Yeah.
left. And, so it
Was
was hairy.
Going to get them, or were you pretty certain, it was going to be down to the wire, but you were going to get them, or were you concerned that the whole trip was going to be canceled?
Well, yeah, you've got a lot on the line. We've got everything set up in terms of, we've got people, a fixer over in China, set up. We've got everything, try to set up as much as you can. I mean, the trick in this obviously is to try and be as organized and planned as you can, and plan for chaos, because when you get there, you're just sort of trying to figure out, where can you get to? Frankly, we moved around. We went to the expo, but we got a visa, and they knew this, that we were getting a visa for a couple weeks. Yeah. And we got around the country a bit, and that was important from our perspective. And we didn't have a minder with us, which was also unusual. I'm not saying they didn't know what we were doing. My assumption is they knew.
A minder we didn't know about anyway.
Right. Exactly.
You had one, you just weren't sure who it was.
On any given day. No,
or in all of our phones, right?
Yeah. We assumed it. We took got separate phones. We did all the sort of security, that we could, but we also assumed that they knew what we were doing. Having said that, we moved around and we filmed. So it worked out, I think.
Yeah. Well, and actually, Fritz, I think you had mentioned that when we spoke briefly the other day, sort of what were some of the issues or challenges just in filming, and you had a lot of equipment. You got into
Sure.
to, I believe it was a car plant that, had some very interesting scenes and whatnot. Talk a little bit about, aside from getting the visas, getting the people to talk to you, just to,
Sure. Logistically, anytime these productions go international, it becomes much more challenging. And, getting a crew of 6 into China with a couple $100,000 of equipment is no easy task, and takes a lot of planning. As Rick mentioned, we're always planning for kind of the worst case scenario if something would go wrong. So how we dealt with data, all the media that we were producing in China, which was multiple terabytes. We had extra layers of protection, both so we could kind of monitor what we had and control it, and also get it out of the country if something would go wrong. So there was a lot of extra planning and work that goes into that. Some of the things that happened on the ground when we got there, if I remember correctly, one of the largest interviews with the trade official Wenzhou, the Vice Minister of Commerce, it was rescheduled for about 3 hours after the crew landed in Shanghai. And you never want to go into a big interview after a 22-hour travel day. We ultimately were able to push that back.
It was the next, and then it was like we had to walk a mile carrying all of our gear for a formal interview into the expo, because it had to be in this high security zone that you couldn't possibly get a car anywhere near. And there was no way that we could get any exception to anything.
Wow.
So lots of things that kept the crew on their toes. But ultimately, I think it went very well, and we were able to film in many amazing places, including that WM Motors car manufacturing facility.
Yeah, no, you got some really great footage that you don't see oftentimes. An element, and I can't remember whether that was to film some of that or talk with some of the American business folks there, and I think back also in the United States. But an element that we thought was really great in the story is you talked about kind of the complexity of the position and the role of U.S. companies there. That we've all heard an awful lot about the complaints U.S. companies make about access to the Chinese market, forced joint ventures, fear that their intellectual property is going to be stolen, and those issues. But at the same time, they don't want to go public because they're afraid of retaliation. They don't want to give. You talk about they didn't want to give the U.S. government kind of the evidence that the government could either take to the Chinese government or WTO or whatever to sort of press the case, because it's a huge market and they want access. So they're, you know, there's a sort of two-sided role they're playing. And that's gotten coverage in the business press over the years, but it's rarely talked about, you know, in these very simplistic stories in the general media about, you know, the US versus China. And I'm curious sort of how you kind of came about, you know, was that something you knew about beforehand, or you sort of discovered it in your reporting? What made you decide to make that a larger element of the story, and how'd you get at that part of the story?
I think that part of the story was one of the more shocking things that we learned along the way, was simply how complicit the US business community had been in its own demise when it came to China. So they were sort of almost willing participants on the one hand, and then giant complainers on the other hand. And some of the questions that we asked repeatedly was, how do you get to be both at the same time? And I think that to this day that a lot of American businesses want both. They want to be able to say, this isn't fair, our stuff is getting stolen, or you know, we're not getting equal partnership in these companies. But at the same time, they still want to be in China actively selling, and they don't want to, you know, they want to keep that on the down low. They want to hide behind, they want to hide behind the US government, which what the officials told us was essentially tying the US government's hands, because they can't do much about it if nobody's willing to come forward. So it seems like for almost 20 years, they sort of went around chasing their own tails in a way. So where there was an opportunity from time to time for the US government to come out strong, they were often hand-tied by the businesses themselves not willing to come forward. Even when you saw just incredibly sort of egregious you know, break-ins through cyber situations, you know, like the Google hack, you know, 10 years ago, nobody was willing to come forward to say that this had happened to them. And there were, you know, 20, 30 companies involved in that, and only one came forward. So they, you know, when we were walking around the expo, you could feel it, you could sense it from them. You know, you know, GE and these other companies, they want to talk about how amazing this experience is. At the end of the day, it's engines for airplanes and 1 billion buttons. I mean, who doesn't want to sell 1 billion buttons? So I think that they're hoping that somebody else will resolve this problem, and then they'll keep being able to sell the material. But I think that even in our stories and in all the companies that we reached out to, none of them wanted to go on the record with us either about that.
So I was going to say, you know, Jane, you had asked kind of how we came into this question of looking at business. And, you know, one of the initial questions when we got into this, you know, this was a trade war. So immediately it was about business. But as we started to peel back that history, it was clear that, you know, it was much bigger than just, you know, obviously soybeans and steel. You know, almost every major American company was doing business in China, and China represented the growing market for them. And, you know, our team is often sort of focused on the intersection of, you know, business and politics and how that plays out. And so it was kind of a natural question to say, okay, well, how is this playing out for different kinds of businesses, the kind of businesses that aren't in that headline? And, you know, what we found was that it was, Laura, as you said, impossible to get any of these folks to talk to us. We had initially said, okay, let's follow a company, let's have somebody on the inside sort of take us through what this means, kind of the way that we were actually able to do in China with the electric vehicle factory that we visited, where we had, you know, the head of the company talk to us about what this meant. And US business wasn't willing to go there. And that to us sort of signaled how important that was as a story. And as we talked to policymakers, they, you know, had, you know, run up against this same problem, that they would have people come in, you know, talking, you know, to the president in the Oval Office about the challenges that these business leaders were facing, and then, you know, not being willing to go public, which really made it difficult in part for there to be sort of stronger action on the way that China was treating US business. So, you know, that then became a story we felt like we needed to tell, the fact that business wasn't willing to step out. And, you know, ultimately that was the story that James McGregor was able to, you know, help us convey along with others as a representative of business, because, you know, much like a lot of businesses in the US, they have a representative, they don't want to speak for themselves. And in China, it's like every business has the Chamber of Commerce speak for them to keep that anonymity.
Yeah, he's the guy. He was the head of the American Chinese
Business Council, Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, And I thought it was
Am
interesting.
Cham.
I've been seeing reports by them for 10, 15, 20 years. As Patty mentioned, I was at Business Week for a long time, making exactly this point, but it's always general. It's never this specific company. It's the general thing. So it seems like, yeah, as you said, they kind of want to hide behind the broad group, but that's not enough to actually change policy. Okay, what else? I think, Rick, when we were talking the other day, you guys said that there were a lot of things that did surprise you, and that was one of the biggest. Were there other things as you were going through the reporting that surprised you or sort of changed, preconceived ideas or things, notions that you had about the way this was operating? Anything else that was particularly surprising to any of you?
Yeah, well, I'll just jump in. I mean, I will say personally, I feel like I'm a fairly regular consumer of news, and I was not attuned to the ramifications of what's going on. And I have traveled in China over the decades, but I don't think there's an appreciation for what's happened in China, the rapid pace at which the economy and the entire society has evolved over there. And so that's on one level, is sort of that appreciation for what's happened there. And then at a second level, the reality that the trade war, as we were talking about, is, soybeans or steel, is really about power politics. And Bannon was talking about this, and that's the split. Are we, is it us against them, or can we all get along? And it's really about development and the battle over developing countries choosing what model they're going to pursue. Is it that U.S. model of open markets and global trade, or is it the China model, which we got into and tried to explain in the piece? And those are high stakes.
Yeah. And as I think, Laura, you mentioned earlier, that where that all takes you is a very different place when, at Silicon Valley. Can you maybe talk a little more about, kind of the reporting you were doing there and what you all were discovering there? Because it's such it has such larger ramifications for national security and sort of global economic power and all sorts of things that are much broader than, how many 1,000 tons of soybeans different countries buy.
Right. I think one of the things that stays with me to this day is the last interview that we did in Silicon Valley with the banker who had been in Silicon Valley for decades, one of the sort of original sort of money guys in Silicon Valley that was putting it all together. And he was saying that, he starts off by telling us this crazy story about how a Chinese businessman came and sat down with him and offered him something like $5 billion or something crazy to invest in, one of, sort of four things, microchips or jet engines, or basically all the stuff that's the most competitive, cutting edge things that the United States has right now. And I thought that we were going to go in a direction where he was going to say, no, this is terrible. We can't, they're just going to come and they're going to invest their way into all of this technology, and we're going to give up, the kitchen in the process. And instead, he came out of it with this sort of other story about saying, you can't keep China down even if you wanted to. And that, his sort of the moral of his story was that that you have to look at it from this kind of global Earth perspective, which Bannon would absolutely disagree with, but that we're all in this giant planet together and that all boats can rise at the same time. And he sort of came out of it and said, you can't keep them down if they want to, they're just going to go around you. Yeah. And he was like, we have to focus on ourselves in the United States. Like, what are we teaching kids? Education, building up our own businesses and staying competitive. And it's not really where I was expecting him to go. And I've spent a lot of time since we've done this story thinking about this. Yeah. Is he right or is he wrong? Because I think that this is what's playing out even now. I mean, well, especially now with the Trump administration, which feels very strongly that, China needs to be kept down and they need to be put into this. We cannot have these kind of trade deals in any way that benefit China, and that they're going to simply steal technology. And they would say that the Obama administration was too loose, didn't act enough, and allowed this to go on for too long. I don't know. He was like this sort of third perspective that was like, both of these people are wrong. You have to fight your own way forward, play your own offense, but with also this kind of idea that maybe there's a way for everybody to work together. I don't know what the answer is, though. I really don't. When we sat down in China, and I asked, you know, the head of commerce, you know, that do you steal American technology? I mean, he sat there and he said no. He said no, we do not. And he seemed like a nice man. He didn't seem. I mean, there was no reason to believe him. I don't think he was. I wouldn't know, but I don't think he was lying. You know, and then at the same time, there's this like lineup of decades of theft that has happened to U.S. companies and to U.S. technology. It's confusing. It's very confusing. And even to this day, Bannon, there's sometimes, you know, you're like, yeah, that's a good point. But wait, hold on. I mean, it's just, you know, I think that's part of what we sort of ended up with the film is that nobody really knows how this is going to end, except most people think that China is on the rise. And you can't stand on that waterfront in Shanghai and think anything different. When you see what they did in 40 years, what took us 200, it's mind blowing.
Yeah, which, you know, and going back to what Rick just said, this sort of a level of transformation that there has been in particularly the last 20 years. And I think that a lot of the perceptions of China are still, you know, in the US in general, and a lot of portrayals in the press often are sort of, you know, where China was maybe 15 or 20, 25 years ago. And I do think, you know, you were able to kind of convey a lot of that complexity and a lot of that. And Rick, you had talked a little bit about how you were trying to use the Olympics footage to sort of to show that, to kind of put that in there, to, you know, really make clear, you know, kind of how far China has come with some of that, you know, the sort of coming out that can, I think it was Rick, you were talking about it when we spoke the other day. But
well, I'll throw it to Fritz, because Fritz put that sequence together.
So.
You're mute.
I'm back. Thank you. Yeah, when the team's in the field, I'm back in the edit suite, roughing out sequences and pulling in lots of footage to work with. And one of the things that became very clear was that we could use the 2008 Beijing Olympics as a visual symbol of just how incredibly China had grown. And it was really their kind of coming out party to the world in 2008. So we pulled in a lot of really fantastic footage directly from NBC and the Olympic Committee, and built a really beautiful sequence. And then when we went to try to actually get the licensing and rights for that footage, we realized just how expensive it was. It was going to be something like $50,000 for 30 seconds, which is just, you know, double kind of our stock footage budget. So no way we could use it. And we went back in and actually kind of took a different approach, which was we looked for a lot of found footage from the Olympic spectators themselves and the Chinese people that were in those arenas. And we ended up using that, which was a much better representation of how the Chinese people felt about the moment, and really kind of their way of showing the world what China was capable of. And it was a really interesting exercise in editing, for sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to also add to that. I mean, I think we, you know, it represented the pride that we found when even traveling in China and just talking to people. It's the pride of what they have accomplished there, and the number, you know, and bringing people out of poverty, et cetera. And I think that's why, you know, you need to appreciate that so that you can understand when it's framed, when the conflict is framed as keeping China down, we're going to keep China from advancing, which is, you know, touches nerves. You know, you were there, Jane, like the nerves of history about what's happened to China from you know, foreign interests, right? that's a very powerful force, and is plays to Xi, and he plays off of that, and you know, you have to appreciate what's going on inside China and that Chinese pride.
And sort of to dovetail on that, you know, one of the lessons actually on this sort of technology battle is, you know, not to dismiss the concerns about, theft and competition, but, you know, China has actually developed a lot of its own technology. You look at just sort of WeChat, and I know there's, you know, questions and concerns about, you know, the level of involvement with the government, but it's hard not to be impressed with what that, you know, technology can do. I have to say, it was, you know, I was not exactly a WeChat user before we jumped into this film, but not only, you know, was it integral to making that happen, but has been helpful since for me. And I think that, you know, we have to sort of acknowledge that pride is also a lot of capacity that really is something competitive with where we are in the United States. And that's something that we're not always willing to own up to. And what was, you know, kind of the lesson of, you know, that we need to kind of look at ourselves and, you know, how do we stay competitive, you know, going forward.
Yeah, and actually just playing off of that, because all of that suggests that that the American media, writ large, and I hate referring to media as a whole, because as we all know, there's very different levels of journalism and different media and whatnot. But it suggests that we either haven't done a very good job or just need to do a much better job of explaining what's going on there and explaining some of these concepts and these issues. I wonder whether any of you have any thoughts as to, what more should we be doing? I don't know whether there's further stories you all are doing specifically, but as in general, kind of thinking as journalists, what are the different ways we should be approaching the coverage of China, given, we all know all the difficulties of doing it as well, but to sort of bring some of that home better so that Americans, understand it and better understand the challenges we face.
Well,
I mean,
yeah, oh, go ahead.
no, so I'm just going to say we need better more coverage. I mean, it's the problem of, it's difficult to do and get access. But I think it requires on both parts, both on the American media and on the part of the Chinese government itself, to understand that this is going to be, this is the defining relationship of the 21st century, right? And people need to understand it better. They need to understand what's going on in China better, and the Chinese government has to understand that it's important that the public here understands that. Otherwise, it just gets defined by a lot of political rabble rousing.
Yeah. Okay. We have a couple of questions in the chat from my old Business Week colleague, William Holstein. Hey, Bill. What do you think American companies, particularly tech companies, can do now that trade and technology tensions have deepened? Will they have to take sides? Who wants to take that one?
I think they have to take sides. I do. I think that they, I don't know if the administration is going to come down as strongly as it has sort of against China. And I think what I see is these companies walking this fine line for 15, 20 years, and they have tried to, and it hasn't really worked out that well for them. I mean, they made a lot of money. They made a ton of money for a long time. And now it's like they're getting to a point where China no longer is as the guy who runs the factory said, it's sort of like they're no longer the little brother to the big brother, and he said, it's like getting the little brother smacking the big brother in the face, right? That at some point the relationship equals out, and everybody we talked to said that China is closing that gap, the technology gap. And maybe they're not here now, but a few decades from now, I mean, it's going to be really tight. So if at the moment, the administration is obviously taking a very anti-China stance. And if you're a tech company, yeah, you're gonna either have to, I don't know how you exist in a world where you can make the Trump administration happy while also making the Chinese happy. I don't know how that's possible.
So, I mean, I guess I would say, I don't know that there can be an either or. I think one thing that it was hard to walk away from this without appreciating is how interconnected our relationship is to China, and how much we would stand to lose in terms of our lifestyle today if that relationship was fully severed. And I think that there's a similar, though, different sentiment on the Chinese side, and that I think, one of the challenges was that the Trump administration has taken sort of a very black and white approach, though it hasn't necessarily executed on that. But, for anyone in business, China is going to be there. And, this is something that is going to be complicated and is, not going to go away. And so I think it's about figuring out how to drive American business to be more competitive without cutting China out of the equation. Because if we do that, we have a completely polarized world. And that to me is even scarier.
Yeah, and that's, I think, Rick, as you mentioned, the idea of, do you end up with half the globe operating on the China model, half the globe operating to some degree on the US/Western European model, and that,
I mean, you go to Asia, and China is dominant in so many other places, and these companies that literally, Tencent, whatever, Americans don't even know what they are, but they're some of the largest global companies in the world with dominance in countries worldwide. And were we to completely isolate ourselves, I think that puts the United States in a disadvantage in a lot of other countries as well. It's not to say that there aren't, real policy questions that I think there's bipartisan support that there needs to be changes in how the U.S. approaches that relationship, but that a iron curtain is probably not the best solution here.
Yeah. And Bill actually has a follow-up question, which is, can we remain united in a single worldwide internet, or will we have to divide the internet into different realms?
I'm hoping that, and what I found when we were even just working, not to call out our fixers and sound guys and helpers in China, is that so many people are using VPNs in China. I'm not saying they did. I'm just saying a lot of people are. And I feel like the more that there is access to the rest of the world's internet, the better. It's so tight there with what the information that they have access to. And I would like to see all of China have a good VPN. I think it would make a big difference. I do.
Or not to have the need for one.
Or not to, right, which seems
not likely to
thing, a bigger wish.
Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts on that one?
I don't know. I think I don't have an answer to that. I think it's hard to envision how you balkanize it and what that actually means, and whether or not that doesn't just create a new market for figuring out how to get around the balkanization, or I don't know. I don't have a good answer. It's hard to envision how that plays out. I mean, I think, in reference to your last question about what tech companies could do, I'm not sure, but I can tell you, I think at least, that what they're doing is trying to figure out who's going to win the globalist versus nationalist argument, right? And they're going to have to play that based on the politics and the policies that follow over that internal argument that continues today. The nationalists may have the upper hand at the moment. That could change in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, we're obviously heading into a world that could look completely different a few months from now in terms of policy. Yeah. You talked a little, this may be a difficult question for you to have perspective on, but you talked about how kind of U.S. business, their sense of things is shifting, and the need for them and also U.S. policymakers to kind of recognize more what's gone on in China. And I wonder whether you had any sense when you were talking with either some of the Chinese executives or the policymakers that you talked to there of a recognition of what changes they might also need to make to sort of tamp down, certainly some of the rhetoric and some of the tension, that's caused by things like, Laura, you mentioned, there's a denial that there's been rampant theft, and yet, that's been considered, well known in, both US and European, business and policy circles for, 15 or 20 years. The forced joint ventures that then, walk away with technology and that kind of some of that kind of stuff that is at the heart of, from a US perspective at the conflicts. I don't know whether, do you get any sense from that, or is that just something that would have been too difficult for you to get a sense of when you're talking with Chinese policymakers and business people of, a recognition that those are in fact real issues that need change from their perspective?
It seems that what we mostly heard from both the embassy and the officials that we were talking to in China was that there was not a theft problem. I mean, that seemed to be where they were coming from. We talked to two sort of officials who represented the Chinese government, and one who really was one of the founding, principles in the Chinese and in today's Chinese government. And they both said that this theft is something that the United States has really made up or manufactured, or if there was some, that it was somehow, just sort of rogue companies behaving badly, that this was not state sponsored. I think what we've seen over the years and since our film came out were several more examples of Chinese government and Chinese military intrusions into, there are now several cases that are now going on in the Justice Department. There was not a willingness to own that.
Yeah.
And there has not been from the Chinese government a willingness to acknowledge that. I think that, a lot of people have said, and that I've talked to about this have said, well, the United States is a bunch of hypocrites because you guys, stole a whole bunch of stuff too when you were founded, and you stole a bunch of stuff from the British, and, don't stand on some high horse and pretend like you don't steal anything, and, or that you don't have spies all over the world doing different things too. It's a good point, and it's a valid point. The question is the question at hand for everybody is whether or not the United States and whether or not United States Americans can accept a world where America is not number one. Mm-hmm. And I think that threat terrifies people. And what does it mean when China is a more of a global dominating powerhouse than we are? That's hard for Americans, and that's hard to move forward and think about a world like that, because if China, I mean, we were in, one of the places going through the stalls where people sell a whole lot of things in China. And, there were some Turkish businessmen in this place where they were buying, faucets and sinks and things, the handles for sinks and whatever. And they, basically they sat there and they said, we said, do you care about the US trade war? They were like, no, not at all. And we're like, do you care about the prices, or do you care about the US dollar? They were like, no. I mean, they were like, we do not care. No, it doesn't matter what the United States is doing. What matters to us is our relationship to China and our relationship to the businessmen and business people and business women in China. And I thought that was so telling, because so much of the world is now shifting toward its relationship to China rather than shifting toward its relationships to the United States. I don't know. I'd like to be able to fast forward, half a century and see what happens.
I was just going to say, on the question of sort of, how much does the Chinese government recognize all of this? That's obviously increasingly difficult for the Western press as journalists get pushed out of the country. But, one thing that was certainly clear during the time that we were there and in the reporting that we did is that, while the Chinese government puts on a unified front as this sort of single party, there are reformers, there are, more conservatives inside of the government. It's just not always in the public sort of face the way it would be in the United States. So, it was clear there were folks that were pushing China on this question, but on the other hand, Xi is very much a sort of nationalist and sort of China first kind of leader. And so, to the extent that, we have any vantage point, that's, what's had much of the upper hand lately, as, Xi has taken power and sort of consolidated and closed off other voices inside of China.
And I wonder, this is my last question, and if anybody out there has any further questions, there's nothing right now in the chat. If anybody else does have one, please put it up now, because we're about out of time. But so much, there's obviously very deep, policy conflicts that are going to have to be resolved no matter who's in charge in both countries. But I think some of what has been difficult from the Chinese perspective is, as you say, this sort of sense that, we, and particularly this administration, and, given some of the language used by President Trump, the Bannon, nationalist language that, is seen and perceived as very demeaning towards China, very insulting in many cases. And that's obviously been heightened by his language around the coronavirus, that whatever tensions there were already over trade, that has obviously not helped. And I wonder whether any of you have a perspective of, if we do end up, as the polls would indicate now, and if they are correct this time, with a Biden administration, even if the policies remain fairly tough on trying to, address some of these issues more openly, if there is a different level of rhetoric, whether that will help get to a better, develop, more of the kind of perspective you talked about earlier, where, we kind of have to learn to, to deal with them. We're not going to just be able to sort of squash them and keep them in a box. Do you think that will make much of a difference? Any of you have a sense of that?
I'll say, I think one of the interesting surprises that we found, and it sort of, as we started off the film, actually at the very beginning, was this idea that the Chinese actually thought working with Trump was going to be better for them. He's a businessman. He gets it. They had a lot of, as it was said, high hopes for being able to build that relationship. They had a very good relationship in that Mar-a-Lago meeting at the beginning. So it was interesting to see that, I think they've been caught by surprise at the temperature level that this has gotten to. And so my guess is that they'd be looking to try and, reduce that temperature level. I think there's some benefits, and I expect that, if in fact, as you're saying, we have a Biden administration, I think the first step will be to try to reduce that temperature level. But there's no question, as I think Emma was saying before, is like there's bipartisan support. There has been growing bipartisan support for a stronger, firmer stand against China's trade practices. Whether that then is used as a all-encompassing war against this, power play, global power play, I think that's a much different question. And frankly, you look around and you see all the flashpoints, Taiwan, you see what's happened in Hong Kong, the South China Sea. It's going to be very, very difficult and pretty tense going forward, whoever is in the White House.
Yeah, I would agree. And, whatever the world looks like in, was it 2050, you mentioned, it's going to be a very different place than it is right now. Who knows what direction it will take. But okay, I think that I'm just checking to see if there are any, nope, there are no more questions in the chat room. And I think I've run out of my questions, and we've run out of time in any case. So this was great. I really enjoyed talking with you all. And again, we really thought you did a great job with the piece. So thank you all for being here. Thank everybody out there who's watching this. And that's it, I guess.
And thank you all for a very interesting discussion. As a business reporter my whole life, it was very fascinating, especially that the companies want it both ways. Yeah. So. But thank you all. We'll end the meeting now, and we really appreciate it. Take care and
Thank you.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.